The second time my husband sent the text about running off with my best friend, I was standing in the kitchen on Linden Court, holding the original property deed in my left hand and a glass of water I had no intention of drinking in my right, and the taste of metallic wine was still coating the back of my throat from a life I had already finished living. I know how that sounds. I know. But I'm not going to explain it because I can't and because the explanation wouldn't change what I did next. What matters is that I had 5 days. 5 days between the morning I woke up gasping on my own kitchen floor with my hand pressed flat against cold tile and the morning Derek's thumbs would type the words he'd spent 14 months rehearsing. I had 5 days and a deed and the phone number of a woman named Ruth Greer, who I hadn't met yet, but who would end up saving what was left of my life. My name is Meredith. I'm 34. I'm an architect. I co-founded Vance and Lou with my partner June, and for 9 years I designed buildings I was proud of and signed contracts I read 4 times because that's who I am. I read everything. I checked every number. I caught a misplaced decimal on a contractor's invoice once and saved the firm $11,000. And June laughed and said I had the most expensive eyes in the city. That's the thing people never understood. I wasn't careless. I wasn't naive. I was thorough in every part of my life except the part where I came home to a man who smelled like sandalwood and said, "Trust me, Mar. I've got this," and I believed him because I wanted to, because believing him was easier than reading the 4-page document he'd slid in front of me at dinner with a pen already uncapped. If you're new here, welcome back to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. I need to tell you about the first time, the time that counted, the one I still feel in my body when I wake up too fast. Derek and I met when I was 25 and he was 28. He worked in what he called private investment consulting, which I understood vaguely to mean he helped people manage money. He was calm in a way that made me feel calm. He remembered small things. He brought my mother an orchid, a white phalaenopsis, when she came to visit, and he watered it every Sunday without being asked, and she looked at me across the kitchen and said, "This one's a keeper. Myrrh." I married him 7 months later. The wedding was small. Sloan was my maid of honor. She'd been my roommate sophomore year, and we'd stayed close the way you stay close with someone who knows where all your cracks are. For the first 4 years, everything was fine. Not exciting. Fine. Derek traveled for work. I worked late. We had a routine. He made coffee in the morning. I used soap. I could hear the grinder from the bedroom, that sharp burst of sound that meant the day had started. And I signed things he put in front of me sometimes. A refinance document, a joint account application, things that seemed normal because he said they were normal, and because I was tired, and because the pen was always right there. The refinance happened in year 3. He said rates were dropping and we should lock in. He'd already talked to the lender. He'd already filled out the forms. All I had to do was sign at the bottom of page 6. It was a Wednesday evening. I'd been at the office for 11 hours. My eyes felt gritty. He poured me a glass of wine and set the papers on the kitchen counter, and the pen was uncapped, and he said, "This'll save us $200 a month, Mayor. Just sign here and here." I signed. I didn't read page 4 where the joint tenancy clause converted the house from my sole ownership. I'd bought it before we married with my savings, with the signing bonus from the firm's first major contract, into joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I gave him half my house because I was tired, and he said it was just a refinance, and the wine was good, and the pen was right there. The power of attorney came in year 5. He said it was for convenience. If something happened to him, or if we needed to handle something while one of us was traveling, it was 4 pages. I didn't read it. I know I just told you I read everything 4 times. But this was Derek. This was the man who watered my mother's orchid. I signed at the bottom, and he said, "We're a team, Mir." And I believed him the way you believe someone who's never given you a reason not to. He started making me tea in year 6. Chamomile. Every evening. He said I looked stressed. He said it would help me sleep. He said, "Let me take care of you for once." The tea was warm, and it tasted like flowers, and I drank it every night, and I slept well. And I didn't think about it. I didn't think about the fact that he'd never cooked a meal in 7 years of marriage, but he was suddenly attentive about a cup of tea. I didn't think about it because it felt like love. It felt like the kind of small daily tenderness I'd always wanted. That was the cruelest part later, not the poison. The fact that the poison came disguised as the thing I'd been waiting for. Sloan started coming around more in year 6. Book club on Thursdays, wine on the porch. She knew things about the house, which drawer had the good scissors, where Derek kept the spare charger, which mug was his favorite, in a way that felt either like a close friend or like someone who'd been here when I wasn't. One Thursday, she mentioned the firm's quarterly numbers. She said, "Oh, I heard you had a rough quarter." And I said, "Who told you that?" And she said, "Derek mentioned it." And I stared at her because I hadn't told Derek about the quarter yet. The numbers had come in that afternoon. I'd planned to tell him over the weekend, but Sloan already knew. I let it go. I let it go the way I let everything go. By deciding it didn't mean what it meant. I noticed other things. Derek's phone lit up at 11 p.m. with a message he'd angle away from me. He went to Chicago for a conference and came back with 340 miles on the odometer when Chicago is 180 miles each way. Sloan stopped meeting my eyes when I talked about our anniversary plans. She wore a bracelet I'd never seen before. Silver. Yeah, with a clasp I recognized because I'd seen it in a catalog Derek had left open on his laptop. I noticed all of it. I noticed it the way you notice a stain on a shirt you've already decided to wear. You see it, you know it's there, and you put the shirt on anyway because changing would mean admitting you should have noticed it earlier. October 3rd, a Wednesday. I was at the office reviewing elevation drawings for the Henley Library project when my phone buzzed against the desk. The vibration was soft. The desk was oak, solid. It absorbed sound, but I felt it in my wrist. The message was from Derek. It said, "Mir, I've run off with Sloan. I'm sorry, don't try to find us. I read it 4 times. I'm aware of the irony." The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that don't feel like hours. They feel like falling downstairs. I drove home. The house was quiet. The orchid was on the windowsill, blooming. I went to the safe in the bedroom closet, the one Derek had installed 2 years ago, the one whose combination I'd never memorized because he said he'd handle it, and found it open, empty. The property file was gone, the investment statements, the marriage certificate, the original deed. I pulled up our joint account on my phone. Balance, $43.12. 3 weeks earlier, it had held $61,400. I called the firm's accountant. My 48% stake in Vance and Lou, the shares I'd built over 9 years, the company that was my name on the door, had been transferred to an LLC called DV Holdings via a power of attorney authorization dated 6 months ago, and the accountant said it looked legitimate. She said the paperwork was in order. She said she was sorry. I sat on the kitchen floor. The tile was cold. I remember that specifically. How cold it was, how it seeped through my slacks, how I could feel the grout lines under my palms. The cold traveled up my arms and settled in my chest, and I sat there and I called Derek's phone and it went straight to voicemail, and I called Sloan and it went straight to voicemail, and I sat there and I thought about the power of attorney and the 4 pages I hadn't read and the refinance I hadn't questioned and the tea I'd drunk every night for a year, and I thought, he didn't run. People who run don't empty a safe first. People who run don't transfer shares 6 months in advance. People who run don't put their wife's name on an LLC they opened 8 months before the text. This was planned. This was patient. This was a person who had watered an orchid every Sunday while methodically dismantling my life. I went back to the house that night. I don't know why. Maybe I thought he'd come back. Maybe I just couldn't sit in the office anymore with June looking at me like I was something fragile. The house was dark. I let myself in with the key under the mat. The key I'd told Derek to move a dozen times. The key he said he'd handle.
Derek was in the kitchen. He was calm. He was pouring wine into 2 glasses, the good glasses, the ones we'd gotten as a wedding gift. He said he was sorry things got messy. He said Sloan wasn't really part of the plan. She was just, and he waved his hand, useful. He said she worked at the marketing firm that handled Vance and Lou's account. She had access to the financials. She'd given him the share structure, the account numbers, the operating agreement. She'd been his blueprint for 14 months.
I drank the wine and it tasted metallic, like pennies left in the rain, and I thought that was just the wine, maybe a bad bottle, maybe I was imagining it. My vision went soft at the edges, my hands went heavy, the glass slipped. I looked at Derek and he was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not angry, not scared, not guilty, just watching the way you watch a pot of water you've put on the stove. And he said, "We're a team, Muir. I handled this and I understood right there with the tile under my cheek and the orchid above me on the windowsill and the taste of metal coating the inside of my mouth that I was dying, not falling, not sick, not stressed, being killed by a man who watered flowers." My last thought was stupid. My last thought was, the orchid needs water on Sunday. Don't forget, the last thing I felt was the cold. I woke up on the kitchen floor. The tile was the same cold. The grout lines pressed into my cheek in the same pattern. The orchid was on the windowsill, blooming white, and the morning light came through the curtain at the same angle, and I thought I was still dead. I thought this was the after, whatever the after was, and I was going to spend it on a kitchen floor. My phone was on the counter. I reached for it, and my arm worked. My fingers worked. My lungs worked. My heart was beating. And the screen said September 28th, 6:47 a.m., 5 days before October 3rd, 5 days before the text. I lay there for a long time. I touched the tile. I pressed my fingertips into the grout lines. I smelled the air. Coffee, bitter, drifting from the kitchen, which meant the grinder had already gone off, which meant Derek was already up. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I heard the cabinet open and close. I heard the mug clink against the counter. These were sounds I'd heard 1,000 mornings, and they'd never meant anything, and now they meant everything because I'd heard them the morning I died, and here they were again, identical. The same rhythm, the same sequence, and I was breathing. He came into the kitchen. He was holding 2 mugs. He set one in front of me on the counter. The smell of coffee is bitter, too strong, the way he always made it, hit my nose, and I flinched. My whole body flinched. A full body recoil like someone had pressed ice to my neck. He didn't notice. He was already talking about a meeting, a client, something about the schedule. His voice was the same voice, calm, measured, the voice that said, "We're a team." The voice that said, "I handled this." The voice that said, "Don't try to find us." And the sound of it made my stomach turn so hard I pressed my hand flat against the tile and counted the grout lines under my fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, real. All real. He slid a document across the counter. A renewal form for the power of attorney. He said it was just a routine update. The old one was expiring, needed a fresh signature, shouldn't take a second. The pen was already uncapped. Blue ink, the same blue ink. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking. I could feel the tremor in my wrist, in my fingers, in the joint where my thumb met my palm, and I gripped the pen hard enough that my knuckles went white, and I read the document. All 4 pages for the first time. Page 2, paragraph 3. The grant of authority included the right to transfer, assign, or convey any and all securities, shares, partnership interests, or other ownership holdings. I stared at that paragraph. The words were small. The font was 10 point, maybe smaller. The paragraph was tucked between a section about real estate transactions and a section about tax filings, as if it were routine, as if it were boilerplate, as if it weren't the sentence that had cost me my company. I'd signed it. Without reading it, and he'd used it to take everything I'd built. I smiled at Derek. The smile felt like holding a door shut against a wind. I said I'd sign it later. I needed to review a couple things first. Work stuff. You know how it is. He paused. Something moved behind his eyes. Not suspicion, not exactly. More like a gear catching on a tooth before sliding forward. He said, "Sure, no rush." He kissed my forehead. His lips were dry. His cologne, sandalwood, and something sharp underneath, something that stung the back of my sinuses, made my skin crawl in a way it never had before. He left for his meeting. I sat at the counter and read the document 3 more times, and then I picked up my phone and I called Ruth Greer. I'd never heard of Ruth Greer before, but in the first life, the life where I died, June had mentioned her once after the transfer, after everything fell apart, after I was already gone. June had said to someone, not to me because I was already dead. If she'd called Ruth Greer 6 months ago, none of this would have happened. I hadn't known what she meant. I hadn't been alive to ask. Now I did. Ruth Greer was a corporate litigator at a firm called Greer and Mumbeki, 14 miles from my house in a second-floor office above, a dry cleaner. She specialized in shareholder disputes and fiduciary fraud. I called her at 7:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, and she picked up on the second ring, and I said, "My name is Meredith Vance, and I think my husband is stealing my company." And she said, "Come in at noon and bring every document he's ever asked you to sign." I brought 11 documents. Ruth read them in silence for 14 minutes. I sat in her office, leather chair, cracked at the armrest, the smell of old paper and furniture polish, the elevator hum vibrating through the floorboards, and I watched her face. She didn't react. She read the way I read, which is when I knew she was the right person. She set down the last page and took off her glasses and said the power of attorney was valid on its face. I'd signed it, notarized, witnessed, but, and she held up a finger. The scope was unusual. A convenience POA, which is what Derek had told me it was, doesn't typically include securities transfer authority. That clause is specific. It has to be requested. The fact that it was there meant someone had drafted it for a purpose, and the purpose wasn't convenience. She said if I could show I didn't understand the scope, and the fact that I'd described it as a convenience document mattered. Or if there was evidence of a broader fraudulent scheme, the transfers could be challenged under state fraud statutes. She said the share transfer also likely violated the firm's operating agreement. She asked me if we had one. I said yes. She asked if it required board approval for transfers to non-partners. I said yes. She asked if June had approved any transfer. I said no. She nodded. She said that's a breach of contract on top of the fraud. The transfer to DV Holdings was voidable. She said I needed 2 things: evidence of the affair because motive matters in fraud cases, and evidence of the financial transactions because pattern matters. She also said, almost as an afterthought, looking up from the documents with an expression that was clinical and careful, if there's any chance he's done something to threaten your physical safety, any chance at all, go to St. Anne's and get a blood panel. Don't wait. I asked why. She said because men who forge power of attorney documents to steal their wives' companies don't usually stop at paperwork. I drove home with the windows down. The September air smelled like cut grass and exhaust and something sweet from the bakery 2 blocks over. My hands were steady on the wheel. I had not been steady an hour ago. Something about Ruth's voice, the flat, certain way she said this is solvable, the way she said it like a fact and not a comfort, had pressed a kind of weight into my chest that wasn't panic. It was the opposite. It was the feeling of ground under my feet after weeks of falling. The affair evidence was easier than I expected because I already knew where to look. In the first life, I found out about the restaurant after everything was over. A server mentioned it offhand at a firm event, said Mr. Vance was a regular at the Belmont, always brought the same woman, never his wife. I'd laughed. I'd thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. In this life, I drove to the Belmont on Thursday evening. I sat in the parking lot in my Honda, the 9-year-old Civic Derek always made comments about, said I should upgrade, said it didn't look professional for a partner at an architecture firm, and I watched. The parking lot smelled like asphalt and grease from the kitchen vent. At 7:20 p.m., Derek's leased black Mercedes GLC pulled into the lot. Sloane got out of her own car, a white Audi he'd probably helped her lease 3 spaces away. They didn't kiss in the parking lot. They were too careful for that, but he put his hand on her lower back, and she leaned into it, and they walked in together, and I took 14 photographs with my phone. The timestamp on each one, his face, her face, the restaurant's neon sign reflected in the Mercedes window, the license plate. I sat in the parking lot for an hour after they went inside. The Civic's engine ticked as it cooled, a fly landed on my windshield and walked across the glass, and I watched it and I thought, this fly has no idea what's happening inside that restaurant, and neither did I 6 months ago. When I signed the paper, I went back the following Tuesday. Different night, same routine. This time I sat at the bar, I ordered a glass of wine I didn't drink. The bartender was a young guy with a beard and a tattoo on his wrist, and he set the glass down, and I wrapped my hand around it for warmth, but I didn't lift it to my mouth. I watched Derek and Sloan at a corner table. Derek ordered the lamb. I could hear Sloan laugh. That particular laugh she had, the one that sounded like she was delighted by everything, the one I'd heard 1,000 times in my own kitchen, and the sound cut through the restaurant noise like a frequency I'd been trained to recognize. I recorded 7 minutes of their conversation on my phone, the device pressed against my ribs inside my jacket. At one point, Sloan said, October 3rd, I confirmed the date with the florist. Derek said tell them to deliver to the house, not the office. She said, what about Meredith? He said Meredith won't be a problem after the 3rd. I stopped recording. I put my phone in my purse. I left cash on the bar. Yawa. A $20 for a $12 glass of wine. I didn't wait for change. I walked to my car and I sat in the driver's seat and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and I breathed in, out, in, out. The steering wheel was cool against my skin, smooth, the kind of fake leather that smells like chemicals. I could smell Sloane's perfume. Jasmine, sharp and sweet, the same jasmine I'd smelled on my own couch 100 Thursdays, still in my nose from passing their table. My throat was tight, not crying tight, choking tight, the kind of tight where your body wants to scream, but your brain says not yet, not yet. You don't have enough yet. Be patient. After they left, I went back inside. I asked the bartender if I could have the receipt they'd left at the table. He looked at me funny. I said, I think they took my Uber by mistake and I need the receipt to confirm the drop-off address. He handed it to me. The receipt had Derek's name, the table number, the time, 7:34 p.m., and the lamb, and 2 glasses of a Barolo that cost $22 a glass. I photographed it. I put it in my purse. Friday. I went to St. Anne's. The waiting room smelled like floor wax, and the plastic chairs stuck to the backs of my thighs. I told the intake nurse I'd been experiencing dizziness and fatigue, and I wanted a comprehensive blood panel. She was middle-aged, tired. Her scrubs had cartoon cats on them. She asked about medications. I said none. She asked about supplements. I said a multivitamin. She asked if I'd had anything to drink that tasted unusual. I said, why would you ask that? She said, sometimes metallic taste is a symptom of heavy metal exposure, and we screen for it routinely when patients report fatigue with no obvious cause. I said, yes. Something I've been drinking tastes like pennies. She wrote something on her clipboard and didn't look up. The results came back Monday, September 30th. 3 days before the text. I was sitting in Ruth Greer's office. I'd started going there after work, sitting in the cracked leather chair, drinking the bad coffee from her machine because her office was the only place I felt safe. When my phone buzzed, the lab report, 0.34 milligrams per liter of thallium. Trace amounts accumulating. Chronic exposure. The nurse practitioner's note said this level indicated repeated ingestion over a period of weeks, possibly months. The compound was nearly tasteless in small doses, but produced a metallic aftertaste at higher concentrations, lethal at sustained levels. The source, the note said, was likely something ingested daily. I showed Ruth. She held the phone. She didn't say anything for a long time. The elevator hummed through the floor. Then she said, when did the metallic taste start? I said about 3 weeks ago. Maybe 4. She said, when did Derek start making you tea in the evenings? I stared at her. She said, you told me he makes you chamomile every night. I said, yes, since last year. She said, stop drinking it. Save it. All of it. Every cup in a clean jar. Label the date. Don't let him see you do it. I said, he's been poisoning me for a year. She said, yes. I said in the first life, the wine killed me. The wine was just the last dose. She didn't ask what I meant by first life. She just said the tea is the delivery method. The wine was the accelerant. By October 3rd, the accumulation would have been near lethal. The wine pushed you over. The text was the cover story. I went home. Derek was in the kitchen. He was making tea. The kettle was on, that low hum that builds to a whistle. And the chamomile box was on the counter and the mug was already out. He saw me and smiled and said, rough day. Mare, I made you a cup. He handed it to me. The mug was warm. I could feel the heat through the ceramic. into my palms, and I could smell the chamomile, soft and floral, and underneath it, faint like a memory I couldn't shake, the metallic edge. The same edge I'd tasted in the wine. The same edge that had been in my mouth every night for a year. I said thanks, I took the mug, I went to the bedroom, I closed the door, I poured the tea into a mason jar, I sealed it, I labeled it with a Sharpie, September 30th. I put it in the back of the closet behind a shoebox of old photos. I went back to the kitchen and I rinsed the mug and I said it was perfect, thank you, and I went to bed and I did not sleep. The next night, I did the same thing, and the night after that, 3 jars labeled, dated, hidden. Each night, Derek handed me the mug and smiled and said something gentle. Oh, you look tired, Mir? This'll help, or rough day, or I worry about you. And each night I took the mug and smiled back and poured it into a jar and sealed it and labeled it and hid it. My hands didn't shake anymore. The first night they'd shaken. By the third night they were steady. There's a specific kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what's happening. It's not peace, it's clarity. It's the feeling of a person who has already died once and is not afraid of the shape of the thing that killed her. October 1st. I went to the bank during my lunch break. I'd already opened a new account the previous week, a sole account at a credit union across town, using my maiden name, Cho, using the address of the firm, not the house. I transferred what I could from the joint account before Derek noticed. $18,200, not much, but enough to retain Ruth and to live on for 2 months. I filed a fraud alert on the joint accounts. I contacted the firm's bank and froze the operating account pending a legal review. June called me that afternoon. She said, Meredith, what's going on? The bank called me about the freeze. I said, I need to tell you something and I need you to listen without asking questions until I'm done. She listened. I told her about the power of attorney, the share transfer, the accounts, the affair, the tea. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, I tried to tell you. 6 months ago, Derek came to the office when you were at a site visit. He asked me to sign a document authorizing the transfer of your shares to a holding company. He said you'd approved it. I said you weren't sure about the paperwork. He said you were busy and asked him to handle it. I said I didn't like the sound of it. He said, we're a team, June. Meredith and I handle these things together. I almost signed it, Meredith. I didn't because the operating agreement requires your signature too, and he couldn't produce it. I tried to call you that night, and you said he was just being thorough, and I let it go, and I've been sick about it ever since. I said, I know, June. She said, what do you need? I said, I need you at the gala on Friday, and I need you to say 1 sentence when I ask you to. She said anything. October 2nd, Ruth filed an emergency petition challenging the share transfer and the power of attorney. She submitted the bank records, the restaurant photographs, the receipt with Derek's name, and the lamb and the Barolo, the 7-minute recording, the lab results from St. Anne's, and the 3 saved tea samples. She also contacted the district attorney's office. The poisoning was attempted murder. The share transfer was securities fraud. The power of attorney was obtained through material misrepresentation. The attorney who drafted it had been hired by Derek 8 months before I signed it, and Ruth had already contacted him. He was cooperating. Ruth said the legal case would take months, but the emergency freeze was immediate. DV Holdings could not touch the shares. Derek could not access the joint accounts. The operating agreement violation was clear: no transfer to a non-partner without board approval, and June, who was the board, had never approved anything. The transfer was voidable. The POA was challengeable. The fraud was provable. Ruth said it like a blueprint. She said it like she was reading elevations. I also filed a police report. The detective who took my statement was a woman named Okafor who had tired eyes and wrote everything down in a small notebook with a pen she kept clicking. Click, right. She asked me to describe the first time I noticed the metallic taste. She asked about the tea. She asked about the wine. She asked if Derek had ever made comments about my health. I said he'd said I looked tired lately. He'd said maybe I should see a doctor. He'd said he was worried. He'd said, we're a team, Mare. I'll take care of everything. She wrote that down. She clicked her pen. She said the lab results are consistent with a pattern of intentional dosing. She said the tea samples would be sent to the state lab for confirmation. She said she'd have an officer stationed outside the house by tomorrow. I said, don't. Not yet. She looked at me. I said, I need him to think everything is normal until October 3rd. She said, why October 3rd? I said, because that's when he sends the text. She wrote that down too. October 3rd, Wednesday, 9:14 a.m. I was at the office. My phone buzzed against the desk. The same vibration, the same oak desk, the same soft hum. The message was from Derek. It said, Mur, I've run off with Sloan. I'm sorry, don't try to find us. I read it once. I set the phone face down on the desk. The screen pressed against the oak. I picked it back up. I read it again. I did not respond. I sat at my desk and I looked at the elevation drawings for the Henley Library, and I felt the same falling stairs feeling in my stomach, the same drop, the same vertigo. You see, but this time my hands were on the desk, and the desk was solid, and my feet were on the floor, and I breathed through it. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The coffee on my desk had gone cold. I could smell it, bitter and flat. I called Ruth. I said he sent it. She said, good, that's the text. 9:14 a.m., October 3rd. Timestamped, logged, premeditated. She said, don't go to the house. I said, I know. She said, Detective Okafor is on her way to you. I said, I know. I didn't go to the house. Derek did. I know because Okafor told me later, sitting across from me in the conference room at Greer and Mbeki, her notebook open, her pen clicking. He went to the house at 10:30 a.m., expecting it empty, expecting me collapsed somewhere. The couch, the bedroom, the kitchen floor, because the tea had been working for weeks, and by October 3rd, in the first life, I'd been so tired I could barely climb the stairs. In this life, I'd been pouring it into jars. He walked into the house, and the house was quiet, and the orchid was on the windowsill, and the safe was closed and locked. I'd changed the combination on September 29th, the day after I woke up. And the joint account was frozen, and the shares were frozen, and nothing he'd planned was working. Okafor said a neighbor's security camera caught him standing in the kitchen for 11 minutes. Just standing, not moving, looking at the orchid. Then Sloan called him and Bursbolt. The phone records showed 17 calls between 10:42 and 11:15, and he left. He called me at 11 a.m. I didn't answer. He called again at 11:15. I didn't answer. He texted, Mir, we need to talk. I didn't respond. He texted, I know you're upset, but you need to sign some papers. It's important. I screenshotted every message. I sent them to Ruth. I sent them to Okafor. At 12:30, he texted, Mir, please. I screenshotted that too. The word please. He'd never said please to me in 7 years of marriage. He'd said, trust me. He'd said, I've got this. He'd said, we're a team. He'd never said please. Please was new. Please was the sound of a plan coming apart. The gala was Friday, October 5th, Vance and Lou's 10th anniversary client celebration at the Belmont. Yeah, the same restaurant, the same corner booth area, the same place where he'd brought Sloan twice while I sat at the bar recording them. 180 guests, clients, contractors, city planners, 2 architecture critics, June's family. Derek was on the guest list. He'd been on the guest list for months. Sloan was on the list too. I'd added her name myself 3 weeks ago when I was planning this. I wanted her there. I wanted her in the room when it happened. I wore a navy dress I'd bought in the first life and never worn. Simple. Pockets. I put my phone in the left pocket and a small recording device. The one Ruth's investigator had given me, a black rectangle the size of a lighter, in the right. I arrived at 7 p.m. The Belmont was lit with string lights, and the bar was serving a signature cocktail so June had designed. Gin, cucumber, something with elderflower. And the room sounded like 180 people having a good time. The floor vibrated slightly with the collective weight of footsteps and laughter and the clinking of glasses. Derek was near the bar. He was wearing the gray suit. He was smiling. He looked exactly like a man who hadn't spent the last 2 days discovering that every plan he'd made for the last 14 months had collapsed. He looked like a man who was good at looking zacian calm. Sloan was by the window in a green dress. She was holding a glass of champagne and laughing with a contractor I'd worked with for years. The jasmine from her perfume reached me before I saw her face. It cut through the elderflower and the gin and the floor wax, and it landed in my nose like a signal. I made the rounds. I shook hands. I complimented dresses. I ate a canapé I couldn't taste. The texture was paste on a cracker, and I swallowed it with a sip of water and smiled. At 8:15, June tapped her glass with a spoon and introduced me. I walked to the podium. The room was warm. The string lights made everyone look soft and golden. Derek was at a table near the back, sitting with his legs crossed, holding a glass of wine he wasn't drinking. He looked calm. He looked like a man watching his wife give a speech, which is exactly what he was. I talked about the firm. I talked about the first building we'd designed, a community library in Henley with a reading room that caught the afternoon light in a way I was still proud of. The way the south-facing windows threw a trapezoid of gold across the floor at 3 p.m. every day from September through March. I talked about June. I talked about the clients who trusted us with their buildings. The room was listening. Derek was listening. Sloan was listening. Then I said, I'd like to talk about trust. I said 6 months ago, I signed a document I didn't read, a power of attorney. My husband told me it was for convenience. It was 4 pages. Page 2, paragraph 3, granted authority to transfer any and all securities and ownership holdings. I didn't read it because I trusted him. He used that document to transfer my 48% stake in this firm, the firm that has my name on the door, to an LLC called DV Holdings, which he controls, without the knowledge or approval of my partner June, in violation of our operating agreement, which requires board approval for any transfer to a non-partner. The room was very quiet, 180 people. The string lights hummed. Derek's face didn't change. He was still holding the glass. I could see his knuckles from the podium, so white, the same white as mine when I'd gripped the pen 5 days ago. I said over the past 14 months, my husband systematically drained our joint accounts. $284,500 transferred on September 15th to an account at Meridian Trust, routing number 02100021. Authorized signatory, Derek Vance, secondary signatory, Sloan Castellano. The same Sloan Castellano who is in this room tonight. I have the bank records, I have the wire confirmation, I have the transfer logs. 3 weeks before the transfer, the account held $61,400. On October 3rd, the balance was $43.12. Sloan set down her champagne. The glass made a sound against the table. A small click, the kind of sound that happens in a quiet room. She was looking at the door. The door was being watched by 2 uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Unit who had arrived at 8 p.m. and were standing by the kitchen entrance because Ruth had arranged it with Okafor that morning. I said on the evening of September 24th in this restaurant, at a table approximately 12 feet from where I'm standing, my husband told Sloan, and I have the recording, that Meredith won't be a problem after the 3rd. I played the recording. 7 minutes. The room heard Sloan laugh. The room heard Derek order the lamb. The room heard the sound of a wine glass being set down. The room heard Sloan say, October 3rd, I confirm the date with the florist. The room heard Derek say, tell them to deliver to the house, not the office. The room heard Sloan say, what about Meredith? The room heard Derek say, Meredith won't be a problem after the 3rd. I stopped the recording. The room was silent. Not quiet, silent, the kind of silent where you can hear the air conditioning. Derek was standing. His chair had scraped back. He said, Mir, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. We can talk about this at home. We're a team. I've got this. His voice was calm. His voice was the same voice that had said, we're a team, Mir, while I lay dying on the kitchen floor. The same cadence, the same intonation, the same word, team, that he'd used when he handed me the pen, when he handed me the tea, when he handed me the wine. The same lie in the same voice in the same room. I said, I'm not finished. I said, for the past year, my husband has been making me chamomile tea every evening. He said it would help me sleep. He said he was taking care of me. I drank it every night. 3 weeks ago, I noticed it tasted metallic. I saved every cup. I have 3 samples dated September 30th, October 1st, and October 2nd. I had my blood tested at St. Anne's. The results showed chronic thallium exposure, 0.34 milligrams per liter. The compound was in the tea he handed me with a smile every night, the same way he watered the orchid, the same way he handed me the wine the night he killed me. I didn't say that last part. I almost said it. The words were in my mouth the night he killed me, and I swallowed them because this room didn't need to hear about Rebirth. This room needed evidence. I said, the night he intended to kill me. I said, in this state, poisoning someone with thallium over a period of weeks is attempted murder in the first degree. I have filed a report with the police. Detective Okafor of the Major Crimes Unit is present tonight. I would like to note for the record that on October 3rd, my husband sent me a text message at 9:14 a.m. stating that he had run off with my best friend. He did not run off. He was seen entering our residence at 10:30 a.m. the same morning. He stood in the kitchen for 11 minutes. He made 17 phone calls to Sloan Castellano between 10:42 and 11:15 a.m. The text was not an elopement announcement. It was a staged narrative designed to explain my deterioration and eventual death. He had been poisoning me for weeks. The text was the cover story. The elopement was the story he planned to tell after I was dead. The room was still. 180 people, not moving, not talking. A glass of champagne tipped over on a table near the window, and nobody reached for it. The string lights hummed. I looked at June. She was standing near the podium. She hadn't said anything the entire time. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were wet. I nodded. She stepped forward. She said one sentence I tried to tell her. She wouldn't listen, but I'm listening now. June had tried to tell me 6 months before I died. She'd said Derek asked me to sign something about the firm, and I didn't like how he phrased it. I'd said he's just being thorough. June, he handles the business stuff. She'd let it go. She'd been carrying that for the entire first life, and she hadn't known I was dead, and she hadn't known it was her warning that could have saved me. In this life, I'd listened. In this life, she was standing next to me. In this life, she said the second half of the sentence, but I'm listening now. And the room heard it, and the room understood that June had been the person who almost stopped it, and that almost was the distance between my life and my death. I said thank you. I stepped down from the podium. Detective Okafor moved. 2 officers moved. They came from the kitchen entrance, steady, unhurried. Derek backed up. He knocked into a table. A wine glass fell and broke on the floor, a sharp, bright sound that nobody flinched at because everyone was watching Derek. He said, "Myrrh," and his voice cracked for the first time, the calm finally splitting open like a wall with water behind it. "Myrrh, we can fix this. I can explain. It's not what it sounds like." Sloan was already at the door. An officer stopped her. She said, "I don't know what she's talking about. I don't know anything about this. I was just at dinner and to reporter and her voice was high and thin, and the jasmine perfume was sharp in the air, and the green dress looked less elegant now, looked like a costume, and nobody in the room believed her. Nobody in the room believed either of them. They took Derek out through the kitchen. I watched him go. He was still wearing the gray suit. He looked smaller than I remembered. The gray fabric bunched at the shoulders where the officer held his arm. The orchid was not there. So was there. The orchid was at home on the windowsill, blooming white, still alive, still the thing he'd watered every Sunday while he poisoned my tea. I thought about that orchid. I thought about how careful he'd been with it, how he'd checked the soil with his finger, how he'd wiped the leaves with a damp cloth, how a person can be tender with a plant and lethal with a person and sleep fine in between, how the same hands that measured water for a flower measured thallium for a wife. Derek was charged with attempted murder in the first degree, securities fraud, and obtaining property by false pretenses. Sloan was charged as an accessory to all 3 counts. The power of attorney was voided by the court on October 12th. The judge ruled it had been obtained through material misrepresentation, that the securities transfer clause had been deliberately concealed within routine-looking language, and that Derek's attorney had testified to drafting it at Derek's specific request 8 months before I signed. The share transfer was reversed on October 19th. DV Holdings was dissolved. The $284,500 was recovered from Meridian Trust, where it had been sitting in a money market account earning 4.2% interest. The house on Linden Court was restored to my sole ownership. The joint tenancy created by the refinance was voided as fraudulently induced because Derek had represented the refinance as a rate reduction when its actual purpose was to transfer equity. The court found that every document I'd signed at Derek's request had been part of a coordinated scheme. The sentencing took 4 months. Ruth was there. June was there. Detective Okafor was there with her notebook. Derek's lawyer argued diminished capacity, stress, financial pressure, a momentary lapse in judgment. The judge didn't buy it. The T logs were too consistent. 14 months of nightly dosing, the thallium levels rising in a steady curve that matched the saved samples. The financial transfers were too precise. 14 months of systematic drainage, each transfer below the reporting threshold, each one authorized by the power of attorney I'd signed without reading. The power of attorney had been drafted 8 months before I signed it. The LLC had been registered 6 months before. The affair had been going on for 14 months. The plan had been in motion for longer than some people plan a wedding. There was nothing momentary about it. There was nothing that looked like a lapse. The attorney who drafted the power of attorney testified. He said Derek had come to his office in March of the previous year and described the situation as a business disagreement with his wife. He said Derek had specifically requested the securities transfer clause. He said Derek had told him his wife was, and the attorney looked at the floor when he said this, not financially sophisticated, and would sign whatever he put in front of her. The attorney said he'd had no reason to doubt this at the time. He said he was sorry. I didn't look at him. I was looking at Derek. Derek was looking at the table. Derek was sentenced to 18 years. Sloan got 4. She lost her job at the marketing firm. The same firm that handled Vance and Lou's account, which is how she'd had access to the firm's financial information, the share structure, the account numbers, the operating agreement. She'd handed Derek the blueprint. He'd built the plan. They'd executed it together over 14 months of Sunday, teas and Thursday book clubs, and late-night texts I'd decided not to see. In the courtroom after the verdict, Derek turned to look at me. I was in the 3rd row. Ruth was to my left. June was to my right. Okafor was behind me. Derek looked at me the way he'd looked at me in the kitchen, not angry, not scared, not guilty, just watching on the Euro. And I looked back and I didn't feel the falling stairs feeling. I didn't feel the cold tile. I felt the ground, solid, cold, mine. He'd planned to leave me with nothing, no house, no money, no company, no life. A text message and a dead body and a story about an elopement that explained everything. She was so devastated, people would have said. She collapsed. Stress. Heart failure, maybe. The tea would explain the fatigue. The wine would explain the toxicity. The text would explain the grief. A tidy narrative tied with a bow, and nobody would have looked twice because nobody looks twice at a woman who dies of a broken heart. In the first life, that's exactly what happened. I died on the kitchen floor with the taste of pennies in my mouth and the orchid above me and no one who knew the truth. In this life, he stood in a courthouse with nothing, no shares, no money, no wife, no story. The text he'd rehearsed for 14 months. I've run off with Sloan. I'm sorry. Don't try to find us. Was read aloud in a courtroom as evidence of premeditated murder. The woman he'd planned to run with was sitting 3 rows away in a county jumpsuit. The power of attorney he'd spent 8 months engineering was entered as Exhibit A in his own prosecution. The tea he'd brewed every night with that careful, attentive hand was tested by the state lab and matched to the thallium in my blood. Every tool he'd built to destroy me became the evidence that destroyed him. Every kindness he'd performed was reclassified as a method. The orchid, the tea, the refinance, the pen, always uncapped, always ready. All of it, in the end, was just the shape of the plan. I went home after the sentencing. I changed the locks. I'd been meaning to do it for weeks, but I'd kept putting it off. The way you put off things that feel final, the way you put off admitting that the life you had is over and the life you have is something you built yourself. I stood in the hardware store and I held the new deadbolt in my hand. It was heavy, brass, cold, and I thought about how the last time I'd held something this heavy and this cold, it had been the kitchen tile under my cheek. I installed the lock myself. It took 40 minutes. The screws were stubborn and the old holes didn't quite line up, and I had to drill new ones, and the drill was loud in the quiet house, and my hands were steady the whole time. When I turned the key for the first time and the deadbolt slid home, the sound it made with that solid final click was the best sound I'd ever heard, better than the coffee grinder, better than Sloane's laugh, better than Derek's voice saying we're a team. I put the orchid in the trash. I didn't throw it away hard. I set it in the bin carefully, the way you'd set down something that used to matter, the way you'd close a book you'd finished, and I closed the lid. I opened the curtains in every room, the living room, the bedroom, the kitchen, the house filled with light. It smelled like dust and morning air and furniture polish and nothing else. No sandalwood, no jasmine, no chamomile, just air. I stood in the kitchen where I died and I pressed my hand flat against the tile just for a second, just to feel it, just to check. No. And it was cold and I was alive, and the tile was just tile. It had always been just tile. The cold had never been the enemy. The enemy had been the hand that held the mug. I deleted Sloane's contact from my phone. One contact, one tap, the screen went blank, and her name was gone, and I stood there holding the phone, and I thought, that's it. That's all it takes to erase someone who knew where all your cracks were. One tap, the cracks stay, the person goes. I deleted Derek's contact next. Same tap, same blank screen, 2 taps, 7 years, gone. I put the phone in my pocket, the left pocket, the navy dress pocket, the same dress, and I walked through the house, and every room was quiet, and every room was mine, and the light was good. The first time I died with a pen in my hand and a document I didn't read. The second time I read every word. Trust isn't weakness, but signing away the right to look twice, that's not trust, that's surrender wearing a wedding ring. And the thing about second chances is they don't come with instructions. They come with the memory of cold tile and the taste of metal and the knowledge that the person who handed you the cup is not the person you think they are. Some locks aren't meant to be opened again. They're meant to be installed by the person who survived. If this story reminded you of a time you trusted someone you shouldn't have, or a time you almost signed something you didn't read, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want to hear what happens when the wrong people get it right the second time, subscribe. There's always another story